The morning sun shone through the large windows of Westbridge University, painting golden patterns across the marble floors. Students hurried across the campus, their laughter and chatter filling the air. It was the first day of the new semester, and the energy everywhere was fresh and full of excitement. Some students were meeting friends after the long break, while others nervously checked their schedules for the day. Among the sea of faces, walking into the grand mathematics department was a young woman named Emily Carter. Emily walked quietly, her books hugged close to her chest. She wasn't the type who liked to stand out. While most students walked in groups, Emily preferred to be on her own. She wore simple clothes, a light blue sweater, and jeans, and her hair was neatly tied back. There was nothing loud or flashy about her. But behind her calm and quiet appearance, Emily carried a mind sharper than anyone could imagine as she entered the lecture hall for her first calculus class. She looked around. The room was large, filled with neatly arranged desks and a whiteboard that stretched across the front wall. Students were already taking their seats, some chatting excitedly, others scrolling on their phones. The sound of laughter echoed around, but Emily chose a seat near the back, close to the window. From there, she could see everything but still remain unnoticed. A few minutes later, doors swung open with a firm push, and Professor Harris walked in. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with sharp eyes behind square glasses. His reputation was well known among students, brilliant in mathematics, but known to have a cold, almost arrogant personality. He rarely smiled, and many students feared him. It was said that he took pride in making students struggle, believing that only the toughest deserved to succeed. "Good morning, class," Professor Harris said, his tone brisk and serious. The room immediately went silent. "Welcome to Advanced Calculus. If you are here to relax, this is not the class for you." A few students laughed nervously, but Emily simply lowered her gaze and began taking notes. She had read about this professor before: his teaching style, his high expectations, and his habit of humiliating students who didn't meet his standards. But Emily wasn't afraid. She had faced tougher challenges in life. Still, she didn't want attention. All she wanted was to learn quietly and do her best. Professor Harris began writing equations on the board, his hand moving quickly as numbers and symbols filled the space. "Calculus," he said, "is not just about solving equations. It's about thinking, about logic, precision, and creativity." His voice carried authority, but also a certain pride. He loved being the smartest person in the room, and he made sure everyone knew it. As the lecture went on, Professor Harris began asking questions. "Who can tell me the derivative of this function?" he asked, pointing to the board. A few hands went up. He called on a student, who gave a shaky answer. The professor sighed loudly and said, "Wrong. That's what happens when you don't study properly." The class grew tense. Students shifted in their seats, afraid of being called next. Professor Harris seemed to enjoy the discomfort. It gave him control. His eyes moved around the room until they landed on Emily. She was sitting quietly, her eyes focused on her notebook, her pen moving swiftly as she solved the same problem in her notes. "You there," he said suddenly, pointing at her. "You in the blue sweater. What's your name?" Emily looked up, startled. "Emily Carter, sir," she said softly. "Well, Emily," he said, folding his arms, "you've been awfully quiet. Are you following the lecture, or just pretending to take notes?" A few students snickered. Emily felt a wave of nervousness, but she simply nodded. "I'm following, sir," she replied politely. Professor Harris raised an eyebrow. "Good. Let's see if that's true. Why don't you explain this equation to the class?" Emily froze for a moment. It was only the first day; she hadn't expected to be put on the spot. But she looked at the board, took a deep breath, and calmly explained the concept in simple terms. Her explanation was short, but correct. Professor Harris gave a small nod, clearly not expecting that answer. "Not bad," he said, turning back to the board. "Let's continue." The rest of the class passed quickly. Emily stayed focused, taking notes and quietly solving each problem as he spoke. She didn't raise her hand or try to impress anyone, but everything he said made perfect sense to her. Calculus came naturally. Numbers spoke to her like a language she had mastered long ago. When the lecture ended, students stretched and began chatting again. Some complained about how tough the class was already. Others laughed about how the professor made them nervous. Emily quietly packed her books and slipped out of the room before anyone noticed. Outside, she took a deep breath of the cool morning air and smiled faintly. She loved challenges, and she could already tell this semester would be an interesting one. Meanwhile, back in the classroom, Professor Harris was erasing the board. For a brief moment, he thought about the quiet girl in the blue sweater. There had been something different about her answer, calm, confident, and precise. But he quickly brushed the thought aside. To him, she was just another student. And he had no idea what kind of brilliance she truly carried inside her. Little did he know. That quiet woman he had almost dismissed would soon turn his pride upside down and teach him a lesson he would never forget. The next few weeks at Westbridge University went by quickly. The new semester had settled into its rhythm. Busy corridors, endless assignments, and sleepy students rushing from one class to another. But inside Professor Harris's calculus class, things were very different. His lectures were like intellectual battlegrounds, where students either impressed him or embarrassed themselves. Professor Harris had always been proud, too proud perhaps. He was a brilliant mathematician, no doubt, but his brilliance came with arrogance. He loved control, attention, and the sound of his own voice echoing through the lecture hall. To him, teaching wasn't just about knowledge. It was about power. He enjoyed being the one everyone feared and admired at the same time. Every time a student got an answer wrong, he made sure the whole class noticed. "Incorrect," he would say sharply, followed by a heavy sigh. "You should review your basics before coming to an advanced class like this." The poor student would shrink into their chair as quiet laughter spread around. That was how he kept his authority, through fear and humiliation. Emily Carter, however, remained different. She still sat quietly in her usual seat near the window, her notebook opened and filled with neat calculations. She never interrupted, never argued, and never showed off. But what Professor Harris didn't realize was that Emily solved every single problem he wrote on the board, sometimes even faster than he could explain it. One morning, Professor Harris arrived earlier than usual. He stood by the window, watching the students come in. His sharp eyes noticed how quickly everyone grew silent when he entered. He liked that, the respect, the fear, the way his presence commanded attention. But as he scanned the room, his gaze stopped at Emily. She was, as always, quietly taking her seat, flipping open her book and adjusting her pen. She didn't laugh with others, didn't whisper, didn't even look up much. There was something about her calmness that bothered him. It wasn't fear, it was focus. She looked too calm, too confident for someone who should be nervous in his class. When the lecture began, he started discussing multivariable calculus, filling the board with equations and geometric symbols. "This," he said, turning dramatically toward the class, "is where most students fail. It separates thinkers from memorizers." He asked a question. A hand went up, a confident student from the front row. The student tried to explain, but stumbled midway. Professor Harris smirked. "Exactly as I expected," he said, erasing part of the board. "Anyone else?" No one spoke. The silence grew heavy. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed Emily's hand move slightly, not raised, just writing something in her notebook. She was solving the same problem quietly while everyone else avoided eye contact. That sight irritated him. He walked over to her desk, his footsteps echoing. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone sharp. "Since you seem so busy writing, why don't you come solve this problem for everyone?" The room froze. A few students turned to look at her, whispering under their breath. Emily blinked in surprise. "She hadn't meant to draw attention, sir," she asked softly. "You heard me," he said. "Show us your solution." She hesitated, her heart beating fast. She didn't like being in the spotlight. But she could see that refusing would only make things worse. So she slowly stood up, walked to the front, and picked up the marker. The board looked intimidating: numbers, variables, and partial derivatives everywhere. For a moment, the silence felt endless. Then Emily took a slow breath and began writing. Her movements were gentle but confident. She didn't rush. Line by line, she rewrote the equation, corrected a small mistake in the original question, and began solving it logically, step by step. The class watched in stunned silence. Professor Harris's smirk began to fade. He leaned against the desk, arms crossed, trying to find an error in her work. But there was none. Every line was correct. Every explanation was clear. And when she reached the final step, she boxed the answer neatly and stepped back. "There," she said quietly. "That's the correct solution, sir." The room erupted in whispers. Some students clapped softly, others exchanged amazed looks. Professor Harris stood frozen for a second. His ego didn't want to admit it. But he had just been outsmarted, and by a student he thought was invisible. He cleared his throat. "HMPH. Well, that's acceptable," he said quickly, pretending to sound unimpressed. "You just got lucky this time." Emily gave a polite nod and returned to her seat, her cheeks slightly red, but her eyes calm. She wasn't trying to show off. She had simply done what she always did, solve problems. But inside, Professor Harris was unsettled. That moment replayed in his mind again and again. How had she solved it so quickly? How did she stay so calm under pressure? He didn't like feeling challenged, especially not by a student he had underestimated. The rest of the lecture went on, but his usual confidence was gone. His words stumbled slightly, his rhythm broken. Emily, however, continued to take notes quietly, as if nothing had happened. When the bell rang and students began packing their things, Professor Harris stayed behind, staring at the board. Emily's handwriting still lingered there, neat, precise, perfect. For the first time in years, he felt something unusual in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was curiosity and a touch of embarrassment. He realized he had misjudged her. But his pride wouldn't let him admit it. Not yet. Instead, he convinced himself it was just luck. After all, he was the expert. How could a quiet student possibly know more than him? But deep down, a small voice whispered, "Maybe you've met your match." Professor Harris, and from that day on, his ego would slowly begin to crumble. A week passed after Emily's quiet moment of brilliance in class. Yet the scene still echoed in Professor Harris's mind like an unfinished melody. No matter how much he tried to brush it off, he couldn't forget the calm confidence in her voice, the precision in her writing, or how the entire class had looked at her in silent admiration. It bothered him deeply, not because she was wrong, but because she had been right. He had built his image for years, the untouchable genius, the man no student could outsmart. And then came Emily Carter, the quiet woman who didn't speak unless spoken to, solving his toughest problem as if she'd been born for it. From that day, something changed inside him. Every time he walked into class, he found himself watching her. She didn't seek attention. She didn't brag or even look proud. She just listened, wrote notes, and solved each equation silently. It was her calmness, that quiet confidence, that unnerved him. One Monday morning, he decided to test her again. The air in the classroom was heavy with the usual Monday energy. Sleepy students, coffee cups on desks, and the soft hum of chatter before class. When Professor Harris walked in, silence fell like always. But today, his eyes looked sharper, colder, almost like he had a plan. He began his lecture on advanced integration techniques. His chalk danced quickly across the board, drawing curves, symbols, and equations that grew more and more complex with every line. This, he said, turning to the class, is a problem that even graduate students struggle to solve correctly. Let's see if anyone here is brave enough to try. The class looked around awkwardly. No one raised a hand. They had learned that volunteering in Professor Harris's class was like walking into a trap. A faint smile curved on his lips. No one. How disappointing, he said, shaking his head dramatically. Then his gaze landed on the back corner on Emily. She was, as usual, quietly writing in her notebook, focused, unaware that she was about to be singled out again. "Miss Carter," he said loudly, making several heads turn. "Would you like to give this one a try?" Emily froze for a moment, then looked up. Her calm eyes met his. She could tell by his tone that this wasn't just a question, it was a challenge. She hesitated. "Sir, I can try," she said softly. "Good," he replied, stepping aside with a smirk. "Show us what you've got." Whispers filled the room. Some students looked excited, others pitied her. Everyone remembered what happened last time, but they also knew Professor Harris had made the question much harder this time. Emily stood up slowly, her palms slightly sweaty, but her mind sharp. She walked to the board, picked up the chalk, and stared at the monstrous equation in front of her. It was a mess, layers of trigonometric functions wrapped in integrals, fractions, and substitutions. Even a small mistake could ruin everything. Professor Harris stood with his arms folded, watching like a judge waiting for a failure. The room was completely silent except for the faint, scratching sound of chalk as Emily began to write. She didn't rush. She studied the equation carefully, breaking it down piece by piece. As she worked, the tension in the room thickened. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. But Emily's focus didn't waver. Step by step, she rearranged the expression, simplified it, and performed a substitution no one else had noticed. Her handwriting moved gracefully, confident, clean, and absolutely correct. Professor Harris leaned forward slightly, his smirk fading. He recognized the method she was using. It was elegant, creative, and far beyond the scope of the current syllabus. The class began to whisper again, realizing that Emily wasn't just solving the problem, she was teaching it. When she finally reached the last step, she paused, double-checked her work, and neatly boxed the final answer. Then she turned around and said softly, "That's the solution, sir." For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the class burst into applause. The sound of clapping echoed across the room, breaking through the tension. Emily's cheeks turned slightly pink. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She gave a shy smile, stepping back toward her seat. Professor Harris stood frozen, his pride battling with reality. He glanced at the board again. Her answer was flawless. There was no way to argue against it. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Well," he muttered, "that's acceptable." But his voice lacked conviction. The class knew it. Everyone did. Emily had outsmarted him again, publicly, perfectly, and without a hint of arrogance. As she sat down, a few students whispered praises. "She's a genius," one said. "Unbelievable," another murmured. Professor Harris turned back to the board, pretending to continue the lesson, but his mind was spinning. He felt exposed, defeated in his own domain. His ego, the wall he'd built for years, had cracked again. For the rest of the lecture, he couldn't focus. His sentences trailed off. His explanations stumbled. And every time he glanced toward the back of the room, Emily was there, quiet, calm. taking notes as if nothing extraordinary had happened. When the bell finally rang, the students began to leave, buzzing with excitement. Professor Harris stayed behind, staring once more at the board covered in Emily's handwriting. He couldn't deny it anymore. This young woman wasn't just talented. She was brilliant. She understood calculus in a way that felt natural, effortless, something he hadn't seen in years. But instead of admiration, what rose inside him first was resentment. He told himself, "No student should ever make me feel small." And in that moment, he decided something. The next time, he wouldn't just test her. He'd try to break her. What he didn't realize was that the quiet woman he wanted to humiliate would soon teach him one of the greatest lessons of his life. Asterisk. The day after Emily solved that impossible calculus problem, the entire university seemed to be talking about her. In the cafeteria, in hallways, even in other classes, students whispered about the quiet girl who defeated Professor Harris at his own game. Emily, however, didn't enjoy the attention. She never liked being the center of gossip. Every time she heard someone mention her name, she would lower her eyes, pretending not to listen. All she wanted was to study peacefully. But the rumor had already spread too far. Professor Harris, on the other hand, was not taking it well. His pride had been wounded twice, and this time it stung. He had always believed that no student could ever surpass him in his own classroom. But Emily had done it effortlessly, without arrogance or hesitation. He sat alone in his office that evening, staring at the chalkboard on the wall. Equations filled it from top to bottom, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying that moment in his head, Emily's steady hand writing line after line, her calm voice explaining each step, and the sound of his students clapping for her. It made him feel smaller than he ever had before. How could someone like her be better than me? He thought bitterly. The next morning, as the class filled up, everyone could feel something different in the air. The students were excited, but there was also tension. Professor Harris stood at the front, his expression colder than usual. His tone, when he finally spoke, was sharp like a knife. "Today," he said, "we're going to test your understanding of real-world calculus applications. I hope everyone studied, but everyone knew this wasn't just another lecture. This was his revenge." He turned toward the board and wrote down a long, intimidating problem, one that mixed physics and calculus together. It was full of hidden traps, the kind of question that could make even advanced students panic. He turned around, his eyes locking directly on Emily. "Miss Carter," he said with a thin smile, "since you seem to enjoy challenges, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate this one for us." The class went silent. Some students exchanged uneasy glances. They knew this was personal. He wasn't testing her anymore. He was trying to humiliate her. Emily looked up slowly. She could feel her heart racing, but she didn't show it. She stood up quietly, walked to the board, and picked up the chalk. "All right, sir," she said softly. Professor Harris stepped aside, crossing his arms, his eyes burning with quiet pride. He was sure this time she would fail. The problem was designed to confuse even the best minds. Emily studied the board. The numbers swirled in her mind, and for a few seconds she said nothing. You could hear the faint hum of the ceiling fan, the sound of a pen dropping somewhere in the back. Everyone waited. Then she began. Her first few lines were simple, defining the variables, rewriting the equation, and setting the parameters. But soon, her hand moved faster. Her thoughts flowed naturally, connecting physics principles with calculus theory. She wasn't solving it mechanically, she was understanding it deeply, step by step. She untangled the mess that Professor Harris had created. Every time the equation seemed impossible, she found a path through. Her handwriting filled the board, clean and elegant. The class watched in awe. Whispering stopped. Even the students who didn't fully understand calculus could tell that what they were witnessing was extraordinary. Professor Harris's expression shifted. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as he followed her steps. At first, he looked ready to interrupt, to find an error, a small flaw, something to prove her wrong. But as the minutes passed, he realized there was none. She was right. Every single step made perfect sense. By the time Emily reached the end of the problem, the board was almost full. She boxed the final answer neatly and turned around. "That's the complete solution, sir," she said. Her voice calm and respectful. The room exploded with applause, louder this time, more genuine. Even the students who had once feared Professor Harris were smiling. Some even stood up to clap. Emily gave a small, shy smile, her cheeks turning pink. She didn't bask in the attention. She simply handed the chalk back to the professor and returned to her seat. But Professor Harris didn't move. He stood staring at the board, his mind completely blank. The answer was correct, perfectly correct. And not only that, but her method was smarter than his own. It was simpler, cleaner, and more efficient. For the first time in years, he felt something strange. Not anger, not jealousy, but admiration. The kind he hadn't felt since he was a young student himself. He looked at Emily as she quietly opened her notebook again, as if nothing special had happened. She wasn't proud, she wasn't showing off. She just loved the subject. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Very well done, Miss Carter," he said quietly. His voice had softened, losing the sharpness it once carried. The class ended, but the silence that followed lingered long after the students left. Professor Harris remained standing at the board, staring at the problem Emily had solved. He realized something that humbled him completely. Knowledge wasn't about power, or control, or ego. It was about passion, patience, and humility. And for the first time, the man who had tried to humiliate a student felt small, but in the best possible way. Outside, Emily walked through the campus garden, the cool breeze brushing against her hair. She smiled faintly, unaware that she had just changed someone's life. Because sometimes, the quietest voices teach the loudest lessons. The next morning. Something felt different in Professor Harris's classroom. The same rows of desks, the same whiteboard. The same sunlight spilling through the windows, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. The students who used to enter nervously, whispering under their breath, now walked in with quiet excitement. They weren't talking about homework or exams anymore. They were talking about Emily Carter, the quiet woman who had turned the whole class upside down. "Did you see her yesterday?" One student whispered. "She solved that impossible problem like it was nothing. I swear." Even the professor looked stunned, another said, laughing softly at the back of the room. Emily sat in her usual spot, pretending not to hear. Her head was lowered, her hands neatly folded over her notebook. She didn't like attention, and all of a sudden, admiration made her a little uncomfortable. But inside, she felt something warm. Not pride exactly, but peace. For once, her silence had spoken louder than words. When Professor Harris entered, the chatter stopped immediately. But this time, the silence wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with curiosity. Everyone wanted to see what he would do, whether he'd challenge her again, or simply move on as if nothing had happened. He placed his briefcase on the desk and looked around the class. His face was calm, almost too calm. "Good morning," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Let's begin." He started teaching, writing equations on the board. But even as he spoke, his eyes kept drifting toward Emily. Something about her composure unsettled him, but it also fascinated him. For years, he had believed that authority and brilliance came from dominance. Yet here was a student who had achieved both through silence, humility, and grace. Halfway through the lecture, he asked a question, a difficult one. "Can anyone explain the concept of implicit differentiation using this example?" he said, pointing to the equation on the board. Normally, no one would dare speak. But this time, several hands went up. Students who had once been too scared to participate now looked eager, their faces bright with confidence. Professor Harris blinked in surprise. "All right, go ahead," he said, nodding to a boy in the front row. The boy explained the concept, and though he stumbled a bit, he tried. The professor gave a small nod. "Good effort," he said. Emily watched quietly, smiling faintly. Something had changed, not just in the class, but in the atmosphere. The fear that used to hang over them had started to fade, replaced by genuine interest and courage. Her act of calm brilliance had given others the confidence to try to speak, to believe that even the most intimidating teacher could be impressed by real effort. After class, a few students approached her. "Hey, Emily," one girl said shyly, "you were amazing yesterday. I still can't believe how easily you solved that equation." Emily smiled, her voice gentle. "Thank you. I just really like calculus." Another student laughed. "You like calculus? That's the first time I've ever heard anyone say that." Emily chuckled softly. "It's not about liking the numbers. It's about seeing how everything connects. Once you see the pattern, it feels beautiful." Her words were simple, but they stuck with the others. They realized she didn't study to prove herself. She studied because she loved to learn. And that made her different. Meanwhile, Professor Harris sat alone in his office again, staring out the window. He could hear faint laughter and chatter from the hall, something he wasn't used to. Usually, his class ended in silence, with students walking out stiffly, afraid to make mistakes. But now, there was joy, energy, hope. He thought about Emily again. How she had faced him twice, both times without fear. How she never once showed arrogance, even after proving him wrong. He began to see her not as a student, but as a reflection, a reminder of the passion he once had when he first started teaching. Before the pride, before the ego, before the walls he built around himself. That afternoon, as he prepared for his next lecture, he paused. His hand hovered over a stack of old assignments. For the first time in years, he smiled a real, genuine smile. He realized that Emily had done something extraordinary, not just by solving problems, but by transforming the way he looked at teaching. The next class, when Emily walked in, something even stranger happened. Professor Harris greeted her with a nod. Not the cold, dismissive kind he usually gave, but a respectful one. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he said. A few students exchanged glances, surprised. Emily returned the nod with a quiet smile. "Good morning, sir." That day, the class felt lighter. He encouraged questions, listened patiently, even praised a few students openly. It was as if a door had opened, one that had been locked for too long, as the students packed their bags at the end of the lecture. One of them whispered to Emily, "You've changed him, you know." Emily blinked. "Me, yeah," the girl said with a grin. "He's nicer, softer. Maybe you taught him something too." Emily smiled quietly and looked toward Professor Harris, who was erasing the board slowly, lost in thought. She didn't know whether she had changed him, but she knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, kindness and talent could do what anger and pride never could. And though she remained the quiet woman in the back row, her silence had started something powerful, something that would keep growing. Long after that class ended, as the days turned into weeks, Emily Carter's name spread quietly through the university halls. Professors whispered about her potential, students admired her calm brilliance, and even those who didn't understand calculus were fascinated by the girl who had humbled the most feared lecturer on campus. Yet, Emily didn't change. She still sat in the same seat, wore the same simple clothes, and carried the same quiet grace. She didn't chase attention or praise. If anything, she tried to avoid it. But no matter how quietly she lived, Her light couldn't stay hidden anymore. Professor Harris, however, couldn't stop thinking about her. Every evening after class, he would sit at his desk, replaying every word she said, every line she wrote on the board. He felt a strange mix of guilt, admiration, and curiosity. Who was this girl who saw math not as a competition, but as beauty? One afternoon, unable to hold back his curiosity, he asked the department assistant to bring him Emily's academic file. When he opened it, his eyes widened. Her record was spotless, perfect scores in every subject, glowing remarks from previous teachers, and a scholarship based on exceptional talent. But what caught his attention most wasn't her grades. It was the small note attached at the bottom of the file. Emily Carter, former participant in the International Mathematics Olympiad, assisted in research for applied calculus models in her senior year of high school. Professor Harris leaned back in his chair, stunned. He whispered to himself, "So that's why." He remembered how she never boasted, never spoke about her achievements. She had sat in his classroom like an ordinary student, even though she had already achieved more than most college professors ever would. It hit him then she wasn't quiet because she lacked confidence. She was quiet because she didn't need to prove anything. That evening, he left his office later than usual. As he walked through the nearly empty campus, he saw a faint light coming from one of the smaller classrooms. Curious, he peeked inside. There was Emily alone, sitting at the blackboard, working through equations with chalk in hand. He watched silently for a while. Her face was calm, her eyes bright with focus. She wasn't studying for grades or recognition. She was simply lost in the joy of discovery. The same passion he once had years ago, before ambition turned into arrogance. Finally, he stepped inside. "Still working, Miss Carter?" he asked softly. Emily turned, a bit surprised, but smiling politely. "Oh, hello, Professor. I was just trying to understand a concept from the lecture earlier. I think I found a simpler way to explain it." He walked closer, curiosity overtaking his pride. "A simpler way." She nodded and began to explain. As she talked, her hands moved across the board, drawing clean. Elegant steps that transformed a difficult concept into something beautifully simple. Professor Harris listened carefully. And for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt since his own student days' inspiration. She wasn't just smart. She had a natural gift for teaching, for seeing patterns in chaos, for making complex ideas look effortless. When she finished, she turned to him, almost shyly. "Does that make sense, sir?" He smiled faintly. "More than you know," he said quietly. There was a long silence after that. The kind of silence filled not with awkwardness, but with understanding. For the first time, Professor Harris saw her not just as a student, but as a mirror of who he once was, someone who truly loved learning. Not for grades or recognition, but for the beauty of knowing. "Emily," he said softly, "why didn't you ever tell anyone about your background? About your achievements?" She smiled gently. "Because, sir, I didn't come here to impress anyone. I came to learn. Sometimes when people know your past, they stop seeing who you are now." Her words hit him harder than any equation ever could. He realized how often he had judged students by appearances, how quick he had been to assume weakness from silence. But Emily's quiet strength had shattered all his assumptions. He nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "I owe you an apology, Miss Carter. I thought your silence meant disinterest. I couldn't have been more wrong." Emily's expression softened. "You don't need to apologize, sir. Everyone learns in their own way, even teachers." That simple sentence humbled him completely. For a moment, he stood there, not as a professor, but as a man rediscovering his purpose. When he left the classroom that night, the stars were beginning to appear. He looked up, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. From that day on, the way he taught changed completely. He no longer used fear to demand respect. He encouraged questions, praised effort, and even shared his own mistakes in class. The students noticed. They learned more, smiled more, and no longer dreaded his lectures. And at the center of that quiet transformation was one woman, the quiet genius who never needed applause to make an impact. Emily never sought the spotlight, but her humility and brilliance left a mark deeper than any award or recognition could. And as for Professor Harris, he finally understood that true intelligence isn't loud, proud, or showy. It's calm, patient, and endlessly curious, just like Emily Carter. Asterisk, the final weeks of the semester arrived quietly, just like Emily herself. The trees around Westbridge University had begun to shed their leaves, painting the campus paths in shades of gold and red. The air carried that familiar mix of exhaustion and excitement. Final exams were near, and students spent long nights preparing for them. But inside Professor Harris's classroom, things felt different. The once cold and tense environment had turned warm, even inspiring. The fear that used to hang over the students was gone. Now, there was laughter, discussion, and genuine curiosity. Professor Harris had changed, not in a loud, obvious way, but in the small things that mattered. He smiled more often, listened more patiently, and encouraged even the quietest students to speak up. For the first time, his class felt alive, and deep down, everyone knew who had caused that change. Emily Carter sat quietly in her usual seat near the back, as always. But now, when she walked in, people greeted her with friendly smiles. Her classmates often came to her for help, and she never refused. She would stay after class, explaining difficult concepts in a way that made even the toughest problems seem simple. She didn't act superior. She never made anyone feel small. She just helped humbly, kindly, patiently. One afternoon, after their final lecture of the semester, Professor Harris dismissed the class but asked Emily to stay for a moment. As the last student left, the room grew silent. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching the floating dust in the air. Emily stood by her desk, holding her notebook close, waiting. "Miss Carter," he began, walking slowly toward the board, "I've been teaching for more than 20 years. I've had brilliant students, confident ones, loud ones, competitive ones, but none quite like you." Emily looked surprised. "Thank you, sir. I just try to do my best." He smiled faintly. "That's the thing, Emily. You do more than your best. You teach others without even realizing it. You've reminded me of something I had forgotten, what it truly means to love learning." She didn't speak, but her eyes softened. He continued, his voice calm but full of emotion. "When you first came into my class, I saw a quiet student and assumed you lacked confidence. I was wrong. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was strength. And your patience, your grace, has taught me more than any textbook ever could." Emily smiled gently, lowering her gaze. "I wasn't trying to teach you anything, sir." He chuckled softly. "That's what makes it so powerful." For a moment, both stood in silence. The air between them carried the weight of respect, not just between teacher and student, but between two people who had grown because of each other. Then Professor Harris said something unexpected. "I'm retiring next year," he admitted. "But before I leave, I plan to start something new, a mentorship program for students who love math, not just for grades, but for the joy of it. I'd like you to help me lead it." Emily's eyes widened. "Me? But sir, I'm still a student." "Exactly," he said. "They'll listen to you. You'll remind them that brilliance doesn't need to shout. It can whisper and still be heard." For the first time, Emily felt her throat tighten. She nodded slowly. "I'd be honored, sir." As she left the room, Professor Harris looked after her, a soft smile on his face. He realized how deeply she had changed him. The man who once believed in authority and pride now believed in humility and kindness. In the days that followed, The mentorship program took shape. Emily began helping other students, some who struggled, some who doubted themselves. She shared not only formulas and methods, but also quiet encouragement. Her words were gentle, but they carried power. She told them that intelligence isn't about being better than others. It's about being better than who you were yesterday. Soon, students who once sat in silence began to raise their hands. Those who once feared math started to enjoy it. The classroom that once echoed with tension now echoed with laughter and learning. One afternoon, as Professor Harris watched from his office window, he saw Emily surrounded by a small group of students, explaining something on the outdoor chalkboard near the garden. Her hands moved gracefully, her voice soft but sure. The sunlight glowed on her face, and for a moment, she looked almost radiant, like a quiet force of nature. He smiled to himself. That's what teaching is meant to be, he thought. Not control, not ego, but passing on light. When the semester finally ended, Emily visited his office one last time to say goodbye before the holidays. He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "For teaching the teacher, Professor Harris." Emily smiled, holding back tears. "Thank you, sir." He nodded. "No, Emily, thank you." As she walked out into the winter sunlight, the campus buzzing softly around her, she realized something too, that one act of courage, one moment of standing tall, could change not only her life, but someone else's forever, and somewhere behind her. In that quiet classroom, a once proud man sat by the window, smiling at the memory of the quiet student who reminded him what real genius looks like, not loud, not arrogant, but kind, humble, and full of heart. Because in the end, the greatest lessons aren't taught through words, they're shown through actions, humility, and compassion.